Coming up on Point Spread Weekly, powered by the Vegas Stats and Information Network. We want to make you a better handicapper, and we've got plenty of sports wagering information. Join VSiN's betting experts and odds makers as they discuss sides, totals, money lines, props, and parlays, so you take sharper action. Cashing tickets is what it's all about. It's Point Spread Weekly, powered by VSiN, and it starts right now.
Welcome in. I'm Jonathan Von Tobel. Another week of Point Spread Weekly here on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. Remember to get in on this. VSiN Plus subs are free. VSiN.com/subscribe until all these major sports returns. We have plenty on tap, of course, for this week as Point Spread Weekly always rolls on. Matt Youmans is going to join us in a few. Him and myself both have mock drafts up as we get closer and closer, just a few days away from the first round of the NFL draft. We'll talk about the differences in our mocks, some props that we're both looking at to cash on draft day. Ron Flatter is going to be with us as well later in the show, and we're going to talk NFL draft props as well. Not props, when it comes to trends in the NFL draft, because I think there are some interesting things that we don't look at overall when it comes to trends in the National Football League draft. And that's actually where I wanted to start, because that's where I opened up my mock draft with. So it was the first one that I submitted for Point Spread Weekly, and I found that, look, we overvalue, I think, quarterbacks in a lot of different ways, right? When it comes to credit on the field for wins and losses, quarterback record, one of the most overblown stats in the National Football League or in sports stats in general, because there's, 22 other guys that see the field, not including special teams, that are going to play, right? But when it comes to the National Football League draft and when it comes to betting on these quarterbacks, specifically the prop over and under, I think it's a little overvalued that we see a lot of quarterbacks go in the first round. Take history, for example. If you go back since 1999, right? In the 1999 draft, 5 quarterbacks went within the first 12 selections. Since then, 5 quarterbacks have gone in the first round just once, and that was in the 2018 draft in an upset where Lamar Jackson got drafted by the Baltimore Ravens with the 32nd overall pick when they traded back in to get him. But since 1999, if you go back, it's incredible. 6 out of the last 7 years, we've seen 4 or fewer quarterbacks go in the first round of the NFL draft. So history kind of tells you here that you're not going to see 5 quarterbacks go in the first round. It's a rarity that that's going to happen. And so if you're looking at this draft prop overall with quarterbacks, at first when this came out, there's a lot of hype. Hey, look, a guy like Jacob Eason, a guy like Jake Fromm, a guy like Jalen Hurts, they could make their way into that first round because of that extra year of control. And I think history tells us that that is not the case and that we overvalue quarterbacks, especially rookie quarterbacks, right? Think about it from that perspective. When you have a team on the back end of the first round, they are generally contenders. They are coming off of a very good season, unless it's a team like Miami who traded for a selection and they're still picking in the 20 as part of their 3 picks that they have in the first round. These are not teams that you're usually going to see take a flyer on a quarterback because they're probably a really good edge rusher, a very good linebacker away from being a better team than they were the year before, where they most likely made it to the postseason, had a winning record, or were pushing for a playoff berth. And think about that, too, from that perspective. There is another playoff seed available this year in the NFL. So if you're a team that is on the precipice of maybe competing, right, which I find, and I'm going to talk about this with Youmans, I find the 6th pick fascinating. Because a team like the Los Angeles Chargers, who were in the divisional round 2 years ago, who revamped their offensive line, who could maybe draft an Isaiah Simmons as opposed to going quarterback here and make their way to that final playoff selection or maybe a little bit higher. That is going to be one of the spots where this draft turns. So when I looked at this, I got a little bit crazier with it. Not only do I think that this quarterback prop at 4 is going to be the hard cap, I went under. I had 3 quarterbacks going in my first mock draft in the first round. And a guy like Jordan Love, he reminds me of a guy actually in the same conference from a few years ago in Josh Allen. Josh Allen had a pretty good year right before his final year at Wyoming, and the final year at Wyoming was pretty bad. Jordan Love had the same thing. The year before at Utah State, the offense was absolutely fantastic. He was dynamic as a signal caller, and then he, along with only one other starter, is back on offense, and his production goes down. And so Jordan Love's in an interesting spot where a team like Indianapolis, who was probably going to be one of these teams that drafted a quarterback, is no longer in the first round, and he could see his stock slip to the point where maybe he is going to be a second-round selection. And the other part of my draft, which I thought was, I think is going to be pretty interesting, is where a guy like Justin Herbert ends up. And if he doesn't go at 6, we could see a slide to where a team like the New England Patriots could find themselves in a position to trade up and maybe acquire a guy like Justin Herbert, which is why one of the props I have is over 6 with his draft position, but that's since moved to 5.5. So there's a lot of moving pieces here with these mock drafts. There's a lot of moving pieces with the NFL draft in general. And that's why we have all these mocks and analysis for it. This is Point Spread Weekly. I'm your host, Jonathan Von Tobel. It's VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. Let's head out to the phone line and hook up with one Matt Youmans. Nice enough to give us a couple minutes, as he usually does here on PSW. Youmans, I was just talking about my mock draft, my first one. So I only had 3 quarterbacks going in the first round. You know this. We've been on the show together for a long time. It's been 3 years now, and every single year I have bet this prop under. This is going to be year 4. I have been really staunch in my belief that, hey, look, we overvalue quarterbacks in the first round of the NFL draft, and I wrote about it in Point Spread Weekly that history kind of tells us that, right? We're not seeing 5 quarterbacks go very often in the first round, and I think betting a prop like that under a 4, where your hard cap sitting at 4, is a little bit beneficial.
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting, and there's so many big events this week. I'm not sure how you picked where to start here, but I guess we'll start with the NFL draft. That's a good idea. You have become a quarterback contrarian bettor when it comes to the NFL draft. I think you're going to bet this under every year for the rest of your life. I'm pretty sure that's going to be your approach to this. And, obviously you are correct about this year. It's not going over 4. I would be stunned. I said during our draft betcast next week, I will fall off my chair and hit the floor if there's a 5th quarterback drafted at the end of the first round. But what's interesting is, there are a couple places where you can bet this. At Circus Sports, you can play under 4.5. The juice has been jacked up to -$5 or -$5.50. But if you think there's no chance there's going to be a 5th quarterback, go ahead and lay the $5. Also, there's another offshore book where you can bet over 3 quarterbacks if you feel like that's a free shot. The 3 are a lock, and then the 4th might go. And the juice on that one, I think, is more like -350. Now, that's going to get hit pretty hard, so I don't expect that number to last. It sure looks like there's going to be 4 quarterbacks, and if not, Jordan Love's going to be the guy who slips out of the first round. I just think it's a little bit too far-fetched to think he's going to slip that far, because you've got guys like John Gruden who would, with the 19th pick, be very tempted to take him. I think the Saints at number 23 would be tempted. And somebody would probably trade into the back end of the first round if he's still on the board, just like the Ravens did with Lamar Jackson. And Lamar Jackson turned out to be the best of the 5 quarterbacks taken in that draft that year, and he was the 5th one off the board. I think Jordan Love's going to go at some point. It's going to be the second half of the first round. But yeah, at this point, why bet over 4? Because you're either going to initially, when Michael Lombardi mentioned on VSiN that he said he wouldn't be shocked if Jacob Eason went at the end of the first round, I thought, okay, bet over 4 and take his shot. It's a free shot that maybe a 5th quarterback goes. I don't think there's any shot now a 5th quarterback goes, and it looks like Jordan Love's going to slip. Todd McShay of ESPN initially had Jordan Love as the 5th or 6th pick in the draft, which you and I thought was ludicrous at the time. I'm just going to say that 3 is a lock and 4 is a good bet, and I'll fall off my chair if a 5th quarterback is picked.
Yep, and if you go up to, by the way, up on my Twitter account, I put up a Google Doc where I went around and I found as many draft props as I possibly could that are available here in Nevada. Caesars does have total quarterbacks drafted in the first round set at 4 with the under at +110. So if you want to get a little bit of a plus price on under 4 and kind of see if you can get that free wager, if Jordan Love does not go in the first round, you're getting a small plus price over at Caesars as of yesterday. I haven't checked it in the last 12 hours or so. And, the other way I attack this too, Youmans, is not only did I bet under the quarterbacks, I bet under because William Hill is a prop, quarterbacks and running backs in the first round at 5. The under was -140. I laid the $140 because I think it's a pretty fair price. The only way that beats me is if 2 running backs, in my opinion, go in the first round, and I don't think that's going to happen either.
No, I would be stunned if that happened as well. By the way, there was a prop out there. I'm not sure if you can still get the number, but you could bet under 5.5 for total quarterbacks and running backs drafted in the first round. You could have played under 5.5. So that was a pretty strong bet as well. I think most of those 5.5s have disappeared. I'm not even sure if that's still out there. I saw it a couple days ago and thought you got to play that because it looks like 1 running back in the first round at most. You think that's going to be DeAndre Swift, and if he goes, it's going to be at the back half of the first round. So, I wouldn't be really surprised at all if no running backs go in the first round. And we see Swift, Jonathan Taylor, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, J.K. Dobbins, all these guys go off the board in the second round. I think that's actually a prop that should have been put up. How many running backs will be drafted in the second round? And that's a lot more interesting than how many will go in the first, because the first we will either have 0 or 1, don't you think?
Oh, yeah. I mean, William Hill had, like, the top-rated running back by most accounts is DeAndre Swift. His draft position is 31.5. So, like, that gives you an idea of where these running backs could go.
Yeah, that'll be one of many things we track on our draft betcast show next week live during the first round. I'm really looking forward to it. And then Point Spread Weekly this week, you got your first mock draft. I've got my third version. I didn't make many changes from number 2 to number 3. I don't try to project many trades. I've got one trade. I think we're going to see 2 or 3 or maybe 4 trades in that first round, and maybe 3 in the top half of the first round. But I projected just one trade, and I might make a couple other slight adjustments before next week's Point Spread Weekly comes out. I've got a lot of bets. I think I've got 11 bets on this draft so far. I think I put at least 10 of those in Point Spread Weekly to this point. And I'll add a few more before the draft next week as well. But Bruce Marshall's also got a mock draft in there. We got plenty of NFL draft coverage in Point Spread Weekly. And I know you're going to talk about it during the show, but I thought Steve Mackinnon did a great job talking about NFL win totals. He had a really detailed column on NFL win totals in PSW this week. And I agreed with a lot of his opinions. And I thought that was really well done by him and PSW. So that's worth picking up. And next week as well, we're going to have a ton of draft coverage, obviously.
So I wanted to focus on a couple of points in your mock draft, the latest one that you have here. Mm-hmm. And I'd say there's 3 picks that really, really intrigue me in terms of some turning points. And the one is number 3, and whether or not Detroit is going to move out of that spot and trade with somebody who wants a quarterback. So that was the trade that you had projected here in your latest mock draft. Miami going to 3, but not to get Tua, to get Justin Herbert. And there's been this shift in the narrative, Youmans, that Justin Herbert is most likely maybe the guy that the Dolphins are going after. And actually, there was a quote out of the Miami Herald that said there has been no team that has done more legwork on Justin Herbert than the Miami Dolphins. So you think this is maybe more than a smokescreen? This is actually something with some legs?
Yeah, I've been reading all those stories. You know, you read constantly about this draft. Every day I'm looking for stories. And, I listen to Michael Lombardi on this network. He's been saying for 2 or 3 weeks that Herbert is going before Tua in this draft because of the medical concerns with Tua. And I tend to believe that as well. And I think the Dolphins do like Justin Herbert a lot. How can you not? Who knows? Maybe he's the next Dan Marino, maybe not. But the Dolphins have to get a quarterback in this draft. There's no way with all these picks the Dolphins can walk away from this draft without a potential franchise quarterback, whether that's Tua or Justin Herbert. So why I projected that trade is rather obvious. Okay, I saw Gil Brandt made Jeff Okudah his 13th ranked player overall in this draft, and I like Okudah a lot. I think he's a top cornerback off the board, and he's going to be, the so-called shutdown corner in the NFL. I think number 3 is a little bit too high to take him. When you're talking about being a GM in this draft or a sports bettor, you're looking for an advantaged play, right? You don't want to take the worst of the number. And I think by taking Jeff Okudah at number 3, the Lions are kind of taking the worst of the number. That's the highest he could possibly go. You want more value with that pick. I think it's a little bit too high to take him. What the Lions ideally would like to do is trade down a little bit, pick up an extra pick, and still get Okudah, maybe still get Isaiah Simmons or somebody else, but they've got to get defensive help. I think it makes a lot of sense for the Lions to try to trade down. It's kind of the same situation, JVT, that the Giants face at number 4. That's too high to take Tristan Wirfs or Wills or any of the top 4 offensive tackles. What the Giants should want to do is trade down 4 or 5 spots, pick up an extra pick, and still take an offensive tackle. I mean, there's not much separation between those 4 guys. If you're taking one at number 4, you're not getting the most value out of that pick. So I think the Lions and Giants are each going to try to trade down, and the Dolphins are going to get a little paranoid. We've got to get our guy. Like you said, you place a little bit too much value on quarterbacks. But teams do panic when they like a quarterback and then their guys on the board. Look at the Bears. The Bears made a needless trade up to number 2 to get Mitchell Trubisky. They just gave away draft picks when they didn't have to move up to get Trubisky. So I think the Dolphins will probably panic a little bit, and they've got so many draft picks they can afford to do it. They could trade number 5 and number 18 to move up to number 3 if that's all it takes. So it's a pretty easy deal to do, and I think it makes sense for both teams, and that's why I projected Herbert and that pick to the Dolphins. And then if the Giants take an offensive lineman, this is where it gets really tricky.
Yep.
Do the Chargers actually – because I think the Lions would take Okudah at number 5. And if not Okudah, they would take Simmons. But what would the Chargers do at number 6? Do the Chargers take Isaiah Simmons, linebacker from Clemson, who I think is a stud, or do they take Tua as the face of the franchise, a guy they can market and maybe get some eyeballs finally on the Chargers in Los Angeles? That's going to be a tough decision because, you look at the personnel in that Chargers defense, that could be elite if you add a guy like Isaiah Simmons. But the temptation, I think, from ownership and maybe in the front office is going to be, hey, we've got to get a franchise quarterback, and Tua is a marketable guy. That could end up being the toughest decision a team faces in this draft. Do you take Isaiah Simmons or do you take Tua if you're the Chargers at number 6? I can't recall who you had the Chargers taking in your mock draft at 6. Who did you have there?
I had Isaiah Simmons, and that's, to me, that you're right. Like, that's the linchpin. What the New York Giants do, and I read a report that Gettleman is looking very, very hard at an offensive lineman and that he wants to select an offensive lineman there. And what the Giants do in terms of a selection there, I think changes the landscape of what's going to happen with the quarterbacks that come after in that spot. Because I'm with you. You look at some of the statistics for the Chargers, Youmans, they were 32nd in forced turnovers. They're mid-20s in DVOA on defense. And on top of that, they added to their offensive line. There's an extra spot in the postseason. The Chargers are an Isaiah Simmons away from becoming a very good defense, challenging for a playoff spot at that number 6 slot. And I think I'm with you. It's extremely hard if you're the Chargers and Isaiah Simmons is sitting there to pass on him and instead draft a quarterback. Because Isaiah Simmons can help you now, and you can maybe go back and get a Jordan Love, get a developmental guy like Eason. And I think that's like those 2 picks, that's where you're going to see how this draft is folded, because if Isaiah Simmons is there at 6, I think it's really hard for the Chargers to pass him up.
I wouldn't pass him up. I wouldn't, but I don't make my mock draft based on what I would do. It's going to be what you think the team is going to do. And there's going to be a lot of pressure, I think, from Chargers ownership. Hey, we got to get Tua. He's marketable. Nobody's paying attention to us in L.A. We draft Tua. People pay attention to us, right?
Yeah.
Here's another thing to look at with the Chargers. Derwin James missed almost all of last season, right? How much better are those defensive numbers you look at for last season for the Chargers if Derwin James is in there? So you add Derwin James, you add Isaiah Simmons with all the personnel the Chargers have, and you don't have a quarterback who turns the ball over all the time like Phillip Rivers did last season. The Chargers are going to be much better off if they draft a guy like Simmons. I think that's the smartest pick for the Chargers to make. I'm not sure they're going to make the smart move at that spot, but that's what I would do, is take Isaiah Simmons if he's there. And then all of a sudden you got a playoff defense, man. You've got one of the best defenses in the NFL with Derwin James back and Isaiah Simmons in there. And then Tyrod Taylor, you can win with him at quarterback because he's not a guy who turns the ball over. And I know Anthony Lynn likes him. So I would take Simmons, but something tells me, and we talked to a Chargers writer on a show this week, and he thought Tua was going to be the pick by the Chargers. That's going to be a really interesting spot there at number 6.
Matt Youmans is with us at Matt Youmans 24/7, VSiN senior editor, also now on Follow the Money here on VSiN. So one of the other props, and I actually bet this over the weekend a couple of times, and I was surprised. And I think in every single one of your mocks, you've had him going in the exact same spot as most mocks have. Derek Brown, where do you think this ceiling is for him? Because William Hill had Derek Brown draft position at 8.5 and pick over the weekend. It's since shifted to 8.5, minus 120 on the under. I don't think there's any way Brown goes past 8.
I would bet that 8.5 under. I think that's a really good play, and that's one of the plays I almost put in as a best bet in my column in Point Spread Weekly this week. It's going to be in there next week, especially if that 8.5 number holds. I have bet that because I don't see Derek Brown slipping below number 7. Carolina lost Luke Kuechly, and you got Carolina signed Teddy Bridgewater. He's going to be the face of the franchise now at quarterback. The Panthers really don't need to make any offensive moves when you're looking at Bridgewater You just made Christian McCaffrey the highest paid running back in the NFL. You got to do something about the defense. So unless Isaiah Simmons slips and he's there, that's the only decision the Carolina Panthers would have to make, right? It's going to be, would you trade out? Possibly, I guess that would be the third option. Would you trade out? Or do you draft Isaiah Simmons or Derek Brown? And Brown is a 325-pound elite run stuffer. And that's the type of guy that the Panthers should be drafting at number 7. I've never changed that pick in my mock draft. I'm not going to change it next week. And I think Carolina would be foolish not to take Brown at number 7.
8.5 over at William Hill, under -120 as it sits right now.
Yeah.
And it's one of those that you can catch. I remember a couple of years ago, right? You with the offensive lineman from Notre Dame. We would have said, 1 or 1.5. And we knew that, too, McGlinchey and Quentin Nelson were both going to be first-round selections.
That's one reason some bookmakers in Vegas are a little bit gun-shy about putting up props, because bettors can get information and beat you on some of these props. And that Notre Dame prop a couple of years ago, with 1.5 offensive linemen was a lock to go over, and it started at like -120 and went up to -1,500, right? So, and both Notre Dame offensive linemen were off the board, like you said, in the top 10. Didn't even have to sweat that one out. But anyway, we have a lot of information in Point Spread Weekly for people to soak in and study all these prop bets. JVT, it's going to be exciting because there are hundreds of prop bets. You look at all the books, and I know you compiled a bunch of these bets and you put them up on Twitter. Just, if you consider PointsBet and FanDuel and DraftKings and everything that's out there in Las Vegas, hundreds of options to bet this draft. And I would say we've done a pretty good job of covering the draft at this point in our weekly magazine.
All right, we're up against it. Youmans, thanks a lot. We'll be back here on Point Spread Weekly. Welcome back into Point Spread Weekly. I'm Jonathan Von Tobel, your host. Another packed edition of PSW. Remember to check it out, VSiN.com/subscribe. You can go up there. All VSiN Plus subs are free until a major sport returns, so you can check out what we got going in this week's edition and future and past editions of Point Spread Weekly. So I submitted my first mock draft this week. I'll have another one coming up next week. And I find this really fascinating, the ceiling and floor of one Justin Herbert out of Oregon. We have, up until I'd say about a week and a half ago, other than, of course, Michael Lombardi, who Matt Youmans has mentioned, has been talking about maybe Justin Herbert being the second quarterback taken off of the board. I think we've widely accepted for a long time that he was going to be the third signal caller coming out. And remember, even after the combine, there was like this narrative push that Jordan Love was going to go ahead of Justin Herbert. And if you listen to The Edge, Youmans and I both talked about in the last segment, weren't really believers in that. So Justin Herbert, I think, is fascinating. And we tie this into that 6th spot for the Los Angeles Chargers. And in my mock draft, I do have Isaiah Simmons going there, slipping to 6. It's hard to pass that up. So the question becomes, if you are Justin Herbert and you are these teams drafting him, where's the next logical spot for Herbert? And as you go down these draft boards, you realize as you go further along that after Los Angeles Chargers, Carolina probably won't spend their 7th overall pick on it. Arizona, we know won't. Jacksonville is an interesting spot at number 9, but I think Gardner Minshew is being a little undervalued just in the fact of what the Jaguars think they have with him. Think about it from this perspective. You have a guy who went 6-6, threw over 20 touchdowns and fewer than 10 interceptions last year. It's something to check out. And if he doesn't work out, you have another top 10 pick potentially to then go ahead and draft a Trevor Lawrence, a Justin Fields in next year's NFL draft. So I think Jacksonville with 2 first-round picks is more likely to add some talent at number 9, or maybe even trade out of the spot, which is actually what I had in my mock draft, trading out of that spot for Tampa Bay to go and acquire one of these offensive linemen who are going to be hot commodities, and to pair up at right tackle for a Tom Brady to give him some bookend tackles and to give him some better protection. So I think what is interesting about all of this is not only the way that Justin Herbert eventually could slide. My one big gamble for my NFL draft props was taking him to be drafted by the New England Patriots at 15-1. Does he slip past 15 to the point where the New England Patriots can make a move to go and get him if he's in that range? I think is a scenario we could see unfold, but it also affects these offensive linemen. And I think this has become one of the more intriguing prop bets that are out there. We have 4 offensive linemen that we think are essentially, as Nick Bogdanovich put it in Youmans' piece in Point Spread Weekly this week, mortal locks, right? Wirfs, Wills, Mekhi Becton, and the one I'm always forgetting out of Georgia. But there's 4 guys, right, that we expect to go in this first round. And then after that, what happens? And you have the offensive lineman, Ezra Cleveland, out of Boise State. You have Josh Jones coming out of Houston, Austin Jackson out of USC. Andrew Thomas, thank you very much, guys, for putting up the graphic like that. So I think there's a possibility where not only do we see 4 or 5 offensive linemen going, there's a real chance we could see up to 7 of these offensive linemen going. Offensive tackle is a need for a lot of these teams, and the class is extremely deep. And maybe we see this effect where not only does a quarterback like Herbert slip, but you see a lot of these teams who need these tackles opt to go for an offensive lineman as opposed to taking a chance, like Jacksonville, for example, and acquiring him. Jacksonville also, remember, because I think Jacksonville's an interesting spot, like there's been an exodus of talent for Jacksonville on the defensive side of the ball, right? Jalen Ramsey is no longer there anymore. Boye is not there anymore. You expect Yannick Ngakoue to be out of there as soon as he possibly can because he doesn't want to be there long term. And so trading back for Jacksonville from 9 to 15 and drafting a C.J. Henderson out of Florida, the cornerback, could be a very viable option for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And I think a guy like C.J. Henderson is fascinating in terms of where he could end up for his draft position. Right now, if you look at it, in terms of his draft position over at William Hill, C.J. Henderson is sitting right there at 15, and it's a pick at -110. So I think betting C.J. Henderson potentially under could be a way to look because Jacksonville, I think, is a really natural landing spot for a cornerback like him. And again, Broncos sitting at 15 have been a team rumored to trade with Jacksonville in that pick because if you look at this draft clump, right, where you go from 11, 12, 13, that's what I consider wide receiver territory. The Jets, the Raiders, the 49ers all can make legitimate cases for drafting a wide receiver in that range. And so maybe the Denver Broncos, who need one of these wide receivers before the big 3 go off the board, right? You don't want to draft a T. Higgins or a Justin Jefferson at 15. Maybe you trade up to 9 to go get that, and then C.J. Henderson goes at 15 for the Jacksonville Jaguars. So I think really the draft is going to start at 6. I actually think it's going to be pretty status quo until we get to 5 and Tua Tagovailoa goes. The Chargers are going to have an interesting choice to make with Isaiah Simmons. And after that, that's where you get to potentially where this madness is going to go. And we haven't even scratched the surface of what's going to happen with these teams with multiple first-round picks. But all that information, Sports and Point Spread Weekly, it's very draft-heavy, and we're not done by a long shot with the NFL Draft. We'll have more on that and NFL Draft trends coming up later here on Point Spread Weekly. But when we return, it's become a weekly occurrence. Ron Flatter will join us when we come back here on Point Spread Weekly. It's VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. Point Spread Weekly. I'm Jonathan Von Tobel, your host. Again, a reminder, Point Spread Weekly, PSW subs, all free until major sports returns. VSiN.com/subscribe is the spot. Jam-packed with information. And what has become a weekly spot on Point Spread Weekly, Ron Flatter, nice enough to give us a couple of minutes. Talk a couple of things. A futures oddity and derby betting. Ron, we appreciate some time as always. We were talking off the air. I will give you this little tidbit. I threw my wallet away the other day. So I got to tell you about that. At some point. Yeah, it's not good. It's not good. Although, I know that it's in a safe place in a landfill somewhere, so it's not like anybody can steal it, but I don't know. Anyway, so let's talk about this because, I've become more and more fascinated with this, road to the Derby. 1, because we've been having you on. You've been writing a lot about it. But 2, there's a lot more time, obviously, to get ready for this as it's now in the distant future, more towards the fall. And you had a great write-up here, not only on who's hot, but I wanted to talk about kind of your opening story here when it comes to overreactions. And we talk about overreactions a lot just in sports in general. But tell us what happened on Saturday over at the Oaktown States and with Mr. Big News and what he was in that race and what he is now in terms of the big picture at the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, this is very odd because he was 46-1 going into the Oaklawn Stakes and won it. So a big long shot winning that race. So now at William Hill, he's 40-1 to win the Kentucky Derby. Now, in the abstract, that means he's a better chance now to win the Kentucky Derby than he was to win this rather minor stakes race on Saturday. Now, look, one's pari-mutuel, one you've got exposure for fixed odds betting. It's apples and oranges, but it is a novelty, and it demonstrates this. While we really don't know how horses are going to grow between the ages of 3 and 3.5 in the context of a Kentucky Derby, since it's never been run this late in a year before. What we do know over time is that fluky horses are fluky. Go back and look at the last 20 winners of the Kentucky Derby. Not one of them ever had a race before the Derby in which they were 60-1 or longer. Mr. Big News was 65-1 in his race before the one he won. What that tells you is, look, you need to have quality to get to the Kentucky Derby and be a legitimate chance. In fact, very few horses who've ever been 60-1 or longer in any race even get to the Kentucky Derby. So Mr. Big News at 40-1, you can have him.
So I'm curious, like, is there a way from our perspective in terms of betting to take advantage of something like this? But I would just think, though, like with index props like this, where the field is so big, it's just as simple as just staying away from it, right? As opposed to finding some way to take advantage of it.
You know, that's maybe the best advice, because I'm having a little bit of fun trying to find long shots. I've been betting 125-1 or longer, as long as 300-1 on horses where we're really just taking a guess based maybe on breeding, something in terms of their growth at this point. But let's not forget, JVT, that if the Kentucky Derby were in May, well, then 4 months out would put us back in January. So we're really talking about where horses would be in January, and that's pretty much a crapshoot as well.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the futures and some more horses that you have your eye on here. And the runner-up in that Oaklawn Stakes was Farmington Road. What has he been like lately? Because runner-up at, 6-1, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, now this was a horse that's actually one that you got to keep an eye on as we go forward here in the Derby picture. He's trained by Todd Pletcher. He added the blinkers for this race, and the hot pace helped him. And that was another part of the Oaklawn Stakes. It was a fluky race. It suddenly started raining right beforehand. The favorite 1,000 words for Bob Baffert basically slipped and went spread eagle coming out of the starting gate, so he became a non-factor, and the horses out front really ran a burner pace. Think about if you're in a foot race when you're younger, or even now, that if somebody goes out really, really fast early in a longer distance race to a certain degree, they're going to come back to you. And that's exactly what happened here. Farmington Road took advantage of it, but he's shown the ability to go ahead and go at a distance to this point in his career. To add a 10th furlong to get to the Derby distance may not be so far-fetched. He was 75-1 at William Hill to win the Derby, now 50. Still, that's not a price I want to pay. I think that's too cheap on the back end, but it's at least a horse that you keep an eye on. If not for the futures, at least as you get closer to the Derby, one that you might look at and see his progress as we get closer to Labor Day weekend.
So two of the horses you also have listed here, not listed in terms of the William Hill futures, right? The shooter shoot and the pneumatic. So the two questions here is obviously, what have they done as of late? And are you expecting them to be added maybe to a futures pool like the fixed odds that they have over at William Hill anytime soon?
They probably will be if they haven't already. I haven't checked today. Shooter shoot and pneumatic actually came up and looked good in winning allowance races at Gulfstream Park in their debuts. And so you're looking at breeding. You're looking at the trainers, Peter Yurton in the case of Shooter Shoot, and Steve Asmussen, who's overdue to win a Derby with pneumatic. And so you look at those two horses and you say, all right, keep an eye on them. They're probably going to get posted at too short a price initially at William Hill. I would think they might not even be 3 digits. I don't touch anything shorter than 3 digits at this point. But again, same story. Keep an eye on them as you go forward, because as we get closer to the race, there might be a sweet spot where maybe a couple months out, they're sitting there at 40-1, 50-1, and you might seize that opportunity.
Now, one of the horses you have listed here that is going to be part of your not hot column is going to be 3 Technique. Now, he's listed at 30-1, pretty short odds as we're sitting out this far. So what's going on with 3 Technique as we stand right now?
It's real simple. He's not going to race in the Kentucky Derby. The connections have already said he had an ankle operation, and so he was taken off the board at William Hill, or at least is in the process of being taken off the board. He'll probably be off by next week. This is a horse owned by Bill Parcells, by the way, but ankle surgery and connections saying he's probably better racing at a mile, something in that neighborhood, not the 1.25 miles of the Derby. So that's a really good reason to stay away from him.
So I'm curious, because you have a lot of others listed here in the not column. Is there any of these, because, right, it's the old adage, buy low, sell high. Are there any of these that are opportunities that you want to buy low on and not necessarily stay away from?
Yeah, I would say as you look at these, I mean, you take a look at horses as I'm taking a look at it. Let's say 1,000 words at 50 to 1. Now, 50 to 1's not a price, again, that I look at, but I think 1,000 words had talent. He's trained by Bob Baffert. He skidded at the start of that race. Now, is he the sort of horse that just does not want to get interested in showing a turn of foot and going longer? Maybe that's the problem with him, but I think that's one. And Gold Street is another at 125 to 1. I think you look at those. Digital at 150 to 1. I think now they could be overlays, and I think you can actually wait a little bit, watch and see how they train over the coming weeks. They're not going to race again for another month at the very least, unless they come back for the Arkansas Derby at the beginning of May. But you still have a little bit of time to play with in looking at them.
Ron Flatter, again, follow him on Twitter at Ron Flatter, weekly contributor to Point Spread Weekly, and it's not just the buy low, sell high, and the horses who are hot and who are not. Two tiny tracks, now big in the business. The other piece up by Ron Flatter and PSW. Flatter, always going to talk to you, man. I'll call you in about an hour so you can come over, help me go to the landfill and search for my wallet.
All right, I'll get the bloodhounds for you.
I like it. All right, Ron Flatter. All right, we're not done. We'll wrap up Point Spread Weekly. More NFL draft on the other side. Welcome back. Last 2 minutes here on Point Spread Weekly, our weekly edition of our weekly missive. You can check out all the details up at vsin.com/subscribe. Remember that all vsin Plus subs are free until a major sport returns. And with that, we head out to the phone line. Matt Devine, nice enough to give us a couple of minutes. Wrote a piece that I was really interested in, draft trends plus props I'd like to see. Matt, thank you very much. We appreciate it. I'm glad you're doing well. So I wanted to start with this because people love trends in sports betting. It really, for some people, they're trend bettors, right? It makes up a backbone of their handicapping. But I feel like over the last few years, we kind of ignored trends in the NFL draft because it's not really a thing that you think there are trends, but there are, and you've brought up quite a few here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think for, what a lot of people look at the draft, the first thing you think of is what are the team needs? Who did we lose? Who did we gain? What are these so-called experts saying with the mock drafts? What are GM tendencies and things like that? It's, primarily the big angles people take when they're considering a draft and who their team, might be taking. And even, now where we've been the last couple of years, considering all the different props that are available for drafts. And, I kind of said, look, we think about baseball and we think about the NFL and games and all the different angles we can take. Is there anything hidden inside of, the data? I went back specifically the last 18 years when we expanded to 32 teams in the NFL and said, what can we find? Are there any basic trends, something interesting, if nothing else, that might help us take advantage of some of these brand new props that are coming out in light of the coronavirus and whatnot? Some maybe different angles that we could take that we can find some good information for.
So obviously the one everybody always talks about is quarterbacks, and the stat that you had up there, 72%, 13 out of the last 18 years. The first overall selection has been a quarterback. What I'm interested in is looking at this overall from the quarterback perspective, because I've dug my heels in on the last few years of betting this quarterback prop under. 2 out of the 3 years I've been successful. Got upset on the final pick of the first round with Lamar Jackson. They traded back in for him. I think we overvalue quarterbacks a lot. And I went back myself to look at the drafts. And you go back, and 6 out of the last 7 years, you've had drafts where you have 4 quarterbacks or fewer. You've only had 5 quarterbacks selected in the first round 2 times since 1999. And to me, like that trend, I think we overvalue all these quarterbacks going in the first round, and there is value on betting these props under. And since draft betting has become more popular in the last 3 years, we've seen that take place.
Absolutely, and I completely agree with that. I think throughout the entire draft, not just the first round, but when we consider quarterbacks, you've got your stud that you consider could be the top upper echelon. Your next Brett Favre and Jim Montana's, pick your poison, right? But really, there is a lot of challenges in really trying to identify, who your quarterback might be of the future. And are there really 5 quarterbacks? Are there more than 4 quarterbacks that are really going to make or break a new team? Are there that many teams that, would consider a new quarterback coming in, sort of the direction they want to go for their future? You look at it historically, and like you said, twice going back to 1999, I think you said, I've got, one time over 4 quarterbacks. That was in 2018. Setting that number at 4.5, there are a lot of potentially good prospects out there, but there are also a lot of other positions that are needed and, good players that are available in the draft. I think might be taken more often this year in the first round than getting to your actually first, your 5 quarterbacks.
Matt Devine's with us. We're talking about draft trends. What did you look at in terms of the exact outcome out of the first 3 overall picks? Because that's actually been offered a couple of spots. What are going to be the outcomes? What are going to be the players selected in the first 3 overall selections in order? What did you find with some of your trends?
Yeah, so that was one of the more interesting trends that I looked at and dug into yesterday as I was writing this article, because you could make your prediction that it's going to be a quarterback and then your defensive end and then your defensive back or whatever the case might be. Going back over the last 18 years, not one time has those first 3 draft picks repeated according to position. So never have we had before, a quarterback, defensive back, quarterback, for example, in the last 3 or 18 years. That pattern hasn't repeated. So whatever we see this year, if we're thinking about betting off of the trend per se, going back, you're probably not going to see something that we've ever seen before, at least in the last 18 years. Right now, I believe the favorite out of the gate here, if I can pull it up on my screen here really quick, is that quarterback combination, along with the defensive back and then along with the cornerback. If it goes, in that order as the favorite, I think at DraftKings and perhaps FanDuel, you put in the players, right? But just thinking from a position perspective, if that falls into suit, this would be a brand new first 3 tier of player positions again, like we haven't seen in the last 18 years. So I think it's tough to say who's going to go where. I think we can, we all have a good feeling like Joe's going to go 1, and then from there, is it going to be Chase Young? That would give us our defensive end at the second spot, and then we're going to see another quarterback go. Where that is, maybe we see Jeff Okudah come in with Detroit. It's really tough to tell where you're going to go in the top 3. I would say that, expect something new again this year that we haven't seen in the past.
So when I looked at this, and I have my mock draft and Point Spread Weekly, and I'm going to submit another one for Point Spread Weekly next week. But when I look at this overall, to me, I think this draft kind of starts with the Giants selection, because not only, and we'll get to your trend, but there's also reports that New York is really looking hard at an offensive tackle. So for me, 1 is how often when your trends came up did an offensive tackle go in that slot? And 2, just your thoughts on what happens from there, because I think if that's an offensive tackle, Isaiah Simmons drops, it changes what the Chargers do, it changes what the Jags do. Like, there's so much that happens if the New York Giants decide to go with an offensive tackle in that slot.
And without a doubt, you're looking at my trends going back to the last 18 years, offensive tackle has been the position that has primarily been taken with that 4th overall pick. 27.78% of the time over the course of the last 18 years, that's 5 offensive tackles out of the last 18 that have been picked going in that number 4 spot. The top 3 positions, most common anyways, through the top 3 spots went quarterback, and then a tie between quarterback and offensive tackle in the 2nd pick. And then in the 3rd pick, it was another quarterback. I think that if the Giants go ahead, again, based off of trends, which is a lot of what I base my article on, if the Giants were to follow suit, go with offensive tackle there, you go to the next spot, you're looking at a defensive back. And that's where I kind of think if things shuffle a little bit, if we get some trades in here and this, looking back to the trends that follow suit, maybe Okudah doesn't fall to Detroit, maybe he falls in the 5th spot, just sort of keeping in line, with where specifically I put together a mock as well. I've got Okudah going in the 5th spot. Again, knowing 33% of the time over the last 18 years, we've got a cornerback safety drafted in the 5th spot of the draft.
Was there anything when you went into your research that you were expecting to find that you maybe didn't, or found the opposite of? Like if you're expecting to see, usually 2 quarterbacks will go on the first 5 picks, things like that. Was there anything you had a mindset going in that changed when you looked at some of the trends?
Yeah, I think, whenever we think about the draft, especially the first round, we think about these flashy positions and, what comes to mind first is typically the quarterback. One of the things that I discovered that I was kind of surprised about when we look back over the last 18 years, that there have been more wide receivers, 66, than quarterbacks drafted, where there are 54 in the first round in the last 18 years. I know this year, I think there's a pretty tall number out there, over under, for the number of wide receivers drafted in this year's draft. So it kind of, continues to fit with that trend that I found. But I was definitely surprised. Hadn't really thought about it that much, but there actually have been more wide receivers drafted in the first round over the last 18 years than quarterbacks.
Yeah. So let's talk about what you want to see in the future, because I know one thing, man, that I want to see is live betting in the draft. If a guy like Justin Herbert starts to slide, I want to see his position change and be able to bet on it. Obviously, that's a little bit different because you can take advantage of it, but live draft betting is, I think, going to be interesting. What are some of the things you want to see in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I called out in my article, and I thought Circa did a phenomenal job for this last year's Super Bowl. They put together that 100 square board where you had a score across the top. I think we're all familiar with the 100 square board, 100 square pool. I would absolutely love to see something like that for the draft. When I first started in the industry back in 2007, trying to figure out exactly what sports betting was and what handicapping was, how I could help people, and how I could also take advantage of information. One of the biggest tips I got was, keeping things simple for the better. If you can come up with a prop, you're going to get more action. If the public, the average bettor, not just professionals, but the bettor can understand it. One of the things that I thought of is that, what if we put together sort of like that 100 square board? Or maybe we've got a listing of all 32 spots in the first round. And then across the top, we said, hey, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, defensive back, so on and so forth. And then for each spot of each round, we gave it a price. All right, nice and simple. If I'm an average bettor, I've got money in my account right now. I'm bored. There's no baseball. There's no NBA. There's no NHL. You know what? Give me something to bet on. Sure, second pick of the draft, Yeah, I think I'll put some money on, let's go with a defensive end to get drafted at, plus 100, or even looking later on the draft, the 30th pick, a pre-draft bet. I will put, I'll take plus 300 on a wide receiver going. Something very simple, easy to follow along with. I don't have to know a player. Heck, if I didn't even want to, I didn't have to know a team. You probably would know a team, right? But boom, I just want to get some action down, get some money down. I'm going to pick a position to be drafted at a certain pick in the first round of the draft. Now, that's one of my concepts. And then even easier, forgetting about each position for each pick of the first round. What if we made it even simpler and said, hey, I've got a column for offense, I've got a column for defense. Do I think the 14th pick is going to be an offensive guy, maybe minus 120, versus a defensive guy coming back at plus 100? Something just very, very simple. I think that your idea also of the live in betting draft would be absolutely phenomenal. Who's off the board? How do the odds change for the next pick or the next pick on down the line? It's another phenomenal idea that I think would go over really well.
Matt, I appreciate some time today, man. Thank you very much. It was an awesome column up in Point Weekly.
Thanks, JVT. I appreciate it. Stay healthy.
Got it, Matt Devine again, Points Per Weekly. There's a lot to, again, we haven't even scratched the surface. So if you're listening, you're thinking, cool, I got all the info. Absolutely not true, because we didn't even touch on the chart that Matt has in here when it comes to looking at the first round position by year, percentages, things like that. So there's a lot to get to in Point Spread Weekly. You haven't heard enough of it here on the show, so make sure you check it out. Remember, VSiN Plus subs are free until major sports returns, so why not take advantage? VSiN.com/subscribe and VSiN.com in general for everything Vegas Stats and Information Network. See you next weekend.